Well, that's the book lunch theme, and we're here to continue with Hannah Arendt's Life of the Mind. I hope the audio is okay. Just checking, make sure everything is clear. We're gonna finish up today, book one or volume one, thinking, and I'm going to talk a little bit at the end about willing, which is, and she also has some comments in the end of this volume in general about, well, we'll see. So we got the book here. Well, that's good. And as you know, I'm using this first edition. There's a, let's see here. There's a couple of things I may want to say up front about this. There's been a pattern in her writing, in her prose, over the past 3 episodes. I believe this is 4th episode. So she has consistently, thus far, talked about people who have inspired her in intellectual history. I'm going to use intellectual history as a kind of a working broad category that can include theologians and secular people and even maybe political leaders. I don't know, but anyhow, that it kind of and they tend to be, if you'll notice, they tended to be sort of the hits. That is, people like Kant, and she talks about Hegel and Duns Scotus, the great theologian, and Augustine, which she'll return to in her Willing book that we'll get to probably episode 5 somewhat. And so that continues here. And so she starts her, we're in the part of the book where she is the title is What Makes Us Think. And so she does a survey thing. She surveys. So she surveys, for example, the Greeks. And then there's a section where she surveys the Romans. Talks about Aristotle, talks about Pericles. And she's, as you notice, she's been reaching, I should say, actually rather suspensefully for a work of serious philosophy, towards this, well, what is this thing called thinking? So what is this thing called love? The Cole Porter song, what is this thing called thinking, is Hannah Arendt's question. And I'm going to get to it here. I should probably just say, outright, as we go by the Roman answer, the Greek answer, the Roman answer, something that she calls the 2-in-1, which is not a dance step, and it's not, it's just and it's not, I should say, I do consider her innovative in the way she talks about the 2-in-1. But she gives, again, great credit to ancestors or precursors, as I've been saying, and so this comes from here, and so there's an interesting little thing where she builds up in a drum roll fashion. Just to start with her text here. Make sure I got my glasses out. I should say it's really fun to deal. There's a kind of a joy, I should say. We're going to deal particularly in this episode today, with some very I don't know, for lack of a better word, serious matters. And some of those matters are actually quite abstract. And I think this is probably will be the most of that. And also she's dealing with a different part of her scholarship, which is not so topical. I mean, not necessarily. It isn't like talking about, I don't know, well, to use a theme that's returned, her encountering the student movements. because she's writing this in 1972-73, and she's teaching at, she taught at Chicago, a new school in New York, Columbia, et cetera, et cetera. So those kinds of things. But she's dealing here, of course, with we'd say more abstract things. And so she has a chapter called The Answer of Socrates. And so she says, to the question, what makes us think, I had been giving, except in Solon's case, historically representative answers offered by professional philosophers. These answers are dubious for precisely that reason. So I'm going to interrupt her prose and say, remember at I think our first episode, she made a jab at professional philosophy. And I made I followed the Groucho Marx joke, club of professional philosophers who would have them as a member. She doesn't want to be a member. I mean, she is in a sense, because she's teaching at those institutions I just mentioned. But that's already, I just thought it was interesting. Answers are dubious for precisely that reason, because they're professional, right? So the question, when asked by the professional, does not arise out of his own experiences while engaged in thinking. It is asked from outside, whether that outside is constituted by his professional interests as a thinker, or by the common sense in himself that makes him question an activity that is out of order in ordinary living. That's a wonderful phrase there. Again, I'm going to talk about her as a writer too. So think about that. Professional interest as a thinker, or common sense in himself that makes him question an activity that is out of order in ordinary living. Out of order in ordinary living. There we go. It's a mouthful there. And the answers we then receive are always too general and vague to have much sense for everyday living, in which thinking, after all, constantly occurs and constantly interrupts the ordinary processes of life, just as ordinary living constantly interrupts thinking. So she's saying two things there. She's saying, of course, that thinking, again, Hannah Arendt is known for defining thinking narrowly. It's not just stuff in the head. It's not things that occur to you throughout the day. No, it's not cogitation. So it's a very non-neurobiological, if I could put it that way, or non-scientific, or at least not only scientific account of thinking. This is a think cup, I promise you. In fact, I'll turn it around so you can see. I should say, think coffee is how I met our producer, Laurie Strickland. Peanut butter and jelly, right? PB&J. I don't know if she's going to... I don't want to get us off track, but I think it's interesting, right? I assume Think's still doing it, still representing in New York City. I don't know. So, where were we? Okay, back to... So, thinking interrupts ordinary course of life, and the ordinary course of life interrupts thinking. Okay. If we strip these answers of their doctrinal content, which of course varies enormously, all we get are confessions of a need. The need to concretize the implications of the Platonic wonder. And that's Platonic as in Plato. It's capitalized too, Plato. She capitalizes. Platonic wonder, the need in Kant of the reasoning faculty to transcend the limitations of the knowable, the need to become reconciled with what actually is, and the course of the world, appearing in Hegel as, in his quotes, quote, the need for philosophy, unquote, which can transform occurrences outside yourself into your own thoughts, or the need to search for the meaning of whatever is or occurs, as I have been saying here, no less generally, no less vaguely. Now, the subordinate clause, or this is an important part of her prose. This is what she just did there is a hallmark of continental writing in general. And if I had time, I would get out a Stew and Hampshire text, or a Bernard Williams text or an Isaiah Berlin text, we would, or some English folks, and we would show how, they don't, they in fact, there's a long, and it's interesting thinking back about my past and my early years. I was always navigating between these two worlds. I had a professor, James Klein. Jim Klein was he was kind of an Americanist, by which I mean American studies. Not that he was rah-rah America, just his field was gerontology, I think. And he was a very captivating New England Conservatory of Music. And I remember we would be reading George Orwell. And when I would shift gears from Jim Klein and go to Sandra Joshua and be reading Foucault and Judith Butler, actually, back when she was, no one knew who she was. I knew she was. I mean, we had read Gender Trouble and Uncorrected Proofs in a seminar at that time. So it's interesting. Your host was part of that very earliest discussion of gender back in 88, 87. But that's, dealing with Butler and she visited and everything. That was I was aware then that these are two sort of different ways of looking at reality. There are also two different ways of constructing a sentence or a paragraph, right? So that's interesting. So she goes on to indulge in kind of a little bit of a suspense here. So the best, in fact, the only way I can think of to get hold of the question is to look for a model, an example of a thinker who was not a professional, again, not beholden to interests, right? Not a professional, who in his person unified two apparently contradictory passions for thinking and acting. Not in the sense of being eager to apply his thoughts or to establish theoretical standards for action, but in the much more relevant sense of being equally at home in both spheres and able to move from one sphere to the other with the greatest apparent ease. Very much as we ourselves constantly move back and forth. We ourselves here in this podcast, in this episode, in life, Hannah Arendt and her students in this book, we're always moving back and forth between experiences in the world of appearances, there's her big thing, appearances, right? And the need for reflecting on them, reflecting on the appearances, evaluating them. Are they legit? Are we correct? Are we accurate? Do we need to know more? Etc., right? So, best suited for this role would be a man who counted himself neither among the many nor among the few. A distinction at least as old as Pythagoras. Now, this is the part of, again, I started this episode talking about this habit in her text of Kant said this, Pythagoras said this, Pericles said this. There's a sense in which to be able to really, truly read this text to the fullest, you kind of would have to have read all these folks, I think, which I have. I've done before we engage with this. I want to be fair. She's a very capacious writer, and she, as we'll see, she's very egalitarian in that she thinks anybody can think if they put their mind to it, and think well if they put their mind to it, or at least serviceably, or whatever, however we want to put it. But there's this canon of text, and she's in this part of the book. She mentions too Shakespeare and Franz Kafka. She goes deep into the Richard II and also deep into one of Franz Kafka's parables, right? Just as she's now evoking Pythagoras, so you would kind of have to know, well, who was Pythagoras and what did he believe? It's that survey quality of her test. She's surveying just like she surveyed the Greeks, surveyed the Romans, and the Christians. She'll return to the Christians next month when we deal with the will, which for her is a deeply, in itself, deeply partly imbued with Christian intellectual history, which is a thing, actually, or at least was once a thing, right? So, anyhow, enough. So it'd have to be a dude, right, or a man. It could be a woman, of course, or a trans person, a person. This is the language. She's writing in 1972, 73, different era. Okay, count for that. Have to be a person who had no aspiration to be a ruler of men, no claim even to be particularly well fitted by his superior wisdom to act in an advisory capacity to those in power, but not a man who submitted meekly to being ruled either. In brief, a thinker who always remained a man among men, plural, men, who did not shun the marketplace, who was a citizen among citizens, doing nothing, claiming nothing, except what, in his opinion, every citizen, remember, she's egalitarian, everybody, every citizen should be and have a right to. Such a man ought to be difficult to find. If he were able to represent for us the actual thinking activity, he would not have left a body of doctrine behind. So no isms. In other words, he would have all these qualities, all these features, but he would never have left behind, he's not Paul, St. Paul, for example. Or he's not Karl Marx. He's not a person who, verse in Scripture, you must believe this, you must follow this, that, he would have avoided that degree of prescription and normativity, right? So, okay. Where am I here? He would not have cared to write down his thoughts, even if, after he was through with thinking, there had been any residue tangible enough to set out in black and white. You will have guessed, drumroll, that I am thinking of Socrates. Of course, right? Always all along. She already discussed Plato to death, Aristotle to death, many things to death, in a phrase. You can never have too much of these folks, is kind of what I'm saying, but, Socrates. So I've got... we have the trumpets blaring and have the music, and so Socrates. Now, Socrates is a big name in philosophy. This is the dialogues, right? This is what all the first year students in the 101 they read. If you think about it, though, there's some other folks, if I can use such a word, who also share some of those features in common with Socrates. He's not the only one, and some of them are quite famous and quite worshipped and extolled in millions of people. Well, Christ, right, and Buddha have some of those qualities too, I would add. So, right. I'm going to take a drink here. I must give a warning, she goes on to say. There is a great deal of controversy about the historical Socrates, and though this is one of the more fascinating topics of learned contention, I shall ignore it, and only mention in passing what is likely to be the chief bone of contention, namely my belief. She's saying this is her belief, that there exists a sharp dividing line between what is authentically Socratic and the philosophy taught by Plato. So she's saying there's this thing that's Socratic, not only a method that's hopefully taught still in jurisprudence and law school, because it's a wonderful method, useful method, but also Socratic as the ideas of this person we've been talking about, Socrates, right? And then there's this other thing, Platonism, or the Plato. Now, of course, she has it in partly for Plato, and she's a critic of Plato, and as so many thinkers are. This was almost a trend. It was actually almost a fashion for, I would say, a good 60, 70 years, 20th century, for all these different schools of philosophy to attack dualism and say what Plato... In much the same sense as there's a fashion for today saying Plato got it right. Every week on my feed there's a new essay about the dangers of illusions and media and the allegory of the cave over and over again, ad nauseum. I'm always getting these updates of the allegory of cave and how it teaches us about that this is why this thing is going wrong, that going. Anyhow, I didn't mean to get, but just an example of she's one of those of who, and as always, she loves Plato and loves Socrates. And again, she's not. These thinkers are great thinkers, yet they get many things wrong, even as while they get many things right. And so that's kind of the. She says the stumbling block here is the fact that Plato used Socrates as the italicized philosopher, not only in the early and clearly Socratic dialogues, but also later when he often made him the spokesman for theories and doctrines that were entirely unsocratic. And she goes on to talk about Diotimus' speech, and I don't want to get into all this because it depends on knowledge of the dialogues and everything, and kind of all that. And she mentions Aquinas. Here's another important passage before we get to the 2-in-1. Oh yeah, that's true. Oh yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Evan, a lot. I mean, there's so much here. And again, my episode, of course, is pitched to a very general, less technical audience, certainly. But anybody can come in and talk. I was very excited to read that. It's really exciting to have people coming in and talking about things like that. So, yes, thank you. The first thing that strikes us in Plato's Socratic dialogues is that they are all, the second time I've used this word, aporetic. Aporetic. Those kind of questions. The argument either leads to nowhere or goes around in circles. In order to know what justice is, you must know what knowledge is. And in order to know that, you must have a previous unexamined notion of knowledge. Hence, quote, a man cannot try to discover either what he knows or what he does not know. If he knows, there is no need of inquiry. If he knows, why inquire, right? No need. If he does not know, he does not even know what it is he is to look for. Unquote. So that's. I'm going ahead because I want to. Excellent. This is literally a page. We're in section 17 before the 2-in-1, which is 18. She says, what I called the quest for meaning appears in Socrates' language as love. That is love in its Greek significance of eros, not the Christian agape. Love as eros is primarily a need. It desires what it has not. So it's like the desire for what's not present, or not present yet. It's a little bit of that kind of thing. As opposed to, I guess agape would be an example of love for just unconditionally all, kind of a very, that's a notion that is in more than one tradition, of course. But she's saying, Hannah Arendt loves to draw these distinctions, which I think are important and following. Men love wisdom and therefore begin to philosophize because they are not wise. And they love beauty and do beauty, as Pericles called it in the funereal oration, because they are not beautiful. So it's sort of like somebody painting a beautiful picture because they themselves are homely. Or, a musician or composer trying to write something, the most beautiful song they can, or the most beautiful poem they can, because they themselves, sense that they're not all that they would want to be or could be. That kind of spirit, right? So, chapter 18, the 2-in-1. Where does this leave us in regard to one of our chief problems? The possible interconnectedness of non-thought, non-thought. This is one of her phrases, entertainment value, non-thought, and evil. So she's going right back to where she started from. She introduced this whole volume with going back to the Eichmann trial, right? And the question of, why do people do bad things? Why do they do evil? Clearly, she's a pluralist. I'm a pluralist. Clearly, I'll say off the cuff that there's more than one kind of evil. It's not all one thing. And of course, the image that she was trying to debunk with her report on Eichmann was the idea of the Ted Bundy model, if I can put it that way, of sort of the passionate, addicted, lustful evildoer, that, kind of has crazy beliefs. And she's trying to paint a kind of a portrait of a little more zombie-like, mindless, kind of rule-following model. And these are kind of, anyhow, I didn't want to go on so long. I'm just saying we're bringing back from earlier episodes these kind of things. So we are left with the conclusion that only people inspired by the Socratic eros, the love of wisdom, beauty, and justice, are capable of thought and can be trusted. In other words, we are left with Plato's noble natures, with a few of whom it may be true that none does evil voluntarily. Yet the implied and dangerous conclusion, everyone wants to do good, quote unquote, is not true even in their case. And this is a heavy sentence she lays on us here. The sad truth of the matter is that most evil is done by people who never made up their minds to be or do either evil or good. Socrates, who, unlike Plato, thought about all subjects and talked with everybody. Again, he doesn't have the elitism of Plato, according to her, right? It's everybody, right? Thought about all subjects, talked with everybody. Cannot have believed that only the few are capable of thought, and that only certain objects of thought, visible to the eyes of the well-trained mind, but ineffable in discourse, bestow dignity and relevance on the thinking activity. If there is anything in thinking that could prevent men from doing evil, it must be some property inherent in the activity itself, regardless of its objects. Okay. And she goes on, of course. Socrates, that lover of perplexities, made very few positive statements. So that's a kind of a thing that's easily caricatured, and people make jokes. Socrates says, what something isn't. A little bit like, I'm reading right now, I have many things I'm involved with. I'm rereading, the Talmud, and there's all these kinds of texts where discussion of, what something is or what something isn't, and how things are defined, and all this kind of so, and she talks about the Gorgias, and the dialogue about rhetoric, and she goes on. And there's another. I've singled out important passages in this because I want to, or what I think is relevant for this purposes here in doing this close reading. She's back to pluralism again. She's a little more, in this passage, is a little more emphatic about her pluralism, which I like, I appreciate. We know of this difference in other respects. Everything that exists among a plurality of things is not simply what it is in its identity, but is also different from others. This being different belongs to its very nature. When we try to get hold of it in thought, wanting to define it, we must take this otherness or difference into account. When we say what a thing is, we must say what it is not italicized, or we would speak in tautologies. Every determination is negation, as Spinoza has it. So again, she's continuing what I was talking about in certain religious or spiritual literature and even secular literature. There's a lot of discussion about identity and difference, and of course God not named by some traditions, or things like that. Nothing perhaps indicates more strongly that man exists essentially in the plural than that his solitude actualizes his merely being conscious of himself, which we probably share with the higher animals, into a duality during the thinking activity. And so it's myself, I'm dividing, literally splitting myself into two, the two in one, right? His solitude actualizes his merely being conscious of himself, right? And so it's the duality of myself with myself that makes thinking a true activity, in which I am both the one who asks and the one who answers. Thinking can become dialectical and critical because it goes through this questioning and answering process. Through the dialogue, and there's some terms here in the language, dialogistia, which actually is traveling through words. This word. This is Arendt showing off her wisdom, her knowledge, her learning. I mean, showing off is not quite accurate because it's so natural to her. It's so part of who she is that she's read all this stuff. She, again, I've been making the claim that in this text that she's constantly going back to these precursors because I think for her, not only does it have value, but she sort of feels a sense of indebtedness, I think. Actually, it comes from gratitude. It's just a working hypothesis, I don't know. And so she can't write a paragraph, or she can't write. She's still the school late teenager in the 20s studying with Karl Jaspers and Martin Heidegger. She's still that person in awe of Augustine's thought. Of course, rejecting Augustine and not, saying, I'm not going to accept everything this dude says or thinks about anything. And yet, what a magnificent author, and that kind of thing. I think there's a little bit of that here. And so she can't help it, she's again, you can read writers, it's interesting, you can read writers that mention nothing. It's like all them. And in the prose, there's a complete absence of any quotes, any names. And some people might actually like or prefer that. They might think it's more pure, or, I don't know. I mean, again, this is not, with Hannah Arendt, you're not going to get that. I mean, I got all this, there's all these kind of books here. And so, I mean, the upside, of course, for our purposes here in an episode like this is that it might inspire some of you folks to read some of these things and go back if you were so inclined. We had a commentator here, Evan Wells, who has read Studebaker. I haven't read Studebaker, so thank you. I have to. That's a different. These are all the things, right? So. Here's another passage I've singled out for closeness. Consciousness is not the same as thinking. Again, she has this, it's like if this book is thinking, and this phone is like consciousness, right? It's sort of like, yeah, there's consciousness. She's not one of these to say consciousness is an illusion, which is fashionable today, alas and alack, or consciousness doesn't exist, or that inanimate objects are conscious. That's the other, God, that's fashionable now, right? Robots and digits on a screen, and information is the same as a person or as an animal. All these sort of very unfortunate ideas that have crept into our. But to be more serious about it, consciousness is sort of this overarching set of relations, if you could put it that way. But in the midst of that is thinking. And she goes on to explain, acts of consciousness have in common with sense experience the fact that they are intentional and therefore cognitive acts, whereas the thinking ego does not think something, but about something. And this act is dialectical. It proceeds in the form of a silent dialogue. Again, solitude, which she, in this volume, she says is very distinct from loneliness. She's very emphatic that solitude, in some respects, is the opposite of loneliness, actually. True solitude, because it enables the very experience that one can have in actually thinking, right? So. Silent dialogue. Without consciousness in the sense of self-awareness, thinking would not even be possible. So it's interesting to read her text anachronistically, by which I mean in a presentist spirit. All these trends that I've been talking about, the scientism and materialism that says that the mind isn't real and that a robot or a machine is the same as a person and all this stuff is interesting in this context. She's saying, sorry. Consciousness is real. Thinking's real. And she says, if you didn't have consciousness and a sense of self-awareness, you would never even think. So in other words, it's like preconditions, right? It's like, and again, I want to remind us that, it's not so much whether she's correct or not. I mean, I should say on these details, I very much agree with her, of course, but I certainly don't agree with all of Hannah Arendt, certainly not political philosophy. We could have a whole, but it's in the spirit of, I actually, every day I work at trying to, so when I'm reading a text, like I said, I was reading some literature, that some Jewish literature and also some sacred literature and things like that. But we could be talking about look, I mean, there's the memoir by Emily Ratajkowski, the model, right? I mean, her very different kind of text, but like when I'm reading anything, in a sense, I'm kind of interested in what they're going to do, in what they create, if that makes sense. So I'm kind of interested in what are they going to create. Hopefully it'll be something of beauty. And this is even more interesting. So in the case of her memoir and many other memoirs and books, and I'm always reading 4 or 5 books at once. I mean, I've got this, this is off topic because this is from my aesthetic series with the Sammy Kahn story, and about an old songwriter. What I'm saying is there's layers. So there's, what often gets called content, which is, like, is it true or not? Did this happen or not? And then, then there's this other thing that interests me a little bit more, I have to say, is did they make something, in Hannah Arendt's word, meaningful? Because Hannah Arendt, draws a distinction between meaning and fact, I think. And she's known for that. I mean, for her, the human being craves meaning. A craving which, of course, could lead us down very unfortunate paths, as we see all around us today. But that for her is a certain kind of striving. And again, she's crediting Socrates, not herself. Arendt is very, it's funny, people talk about Arendt as a cold tone, in the Eichmann discussions, your tone is so mean. Miss Arendt, you treated the Jewish leaders so terribly. Why did you do that? Why did you write that? The tone. But think about this. Think about her gratitude towards Socrates. Look at this. To Socrates, the duality of the two in one meant no more than that if you want to think, you must see to it that the two carry on the dialogue be in good shape. So there's two and one inside a singular self. Both of them have to be in good shape. Kind of like fit, right? That the partners be friends. She italicizes friends. The partner who comes to life when you are alert and alone is the only one from whom you can never get away, except by ceasing to think. It is better to suffer wrong than to do wrong, because you can remain the friend of the sufferer, but who'd want to be the friend of have to live together with some murderer? Who'd want that? She's saying. She's like, I can see her tone of voice being something like that. Not even another murderer would want that. There's always humor in Arendt. I mean, it's kind of, it's there, right? And she goes on to talk about Kant and, now, I don't want to get to all of this because this, again, as you can see, we've made some headway here. But I should mention Richard II, only because I'm interested in what she does with it. I'm not going to get into Franz Kafka. I may, even though the parable is interesting because, again, she's indebted to Kafka. So she says Kafka in this text, the parable, illustrate a notion of past and future and time, and there's a person that's the past and a person that's the future, and there's this person in the middle, and really interesting, imaginative. And again, can't get to everything, but I thought maybe I would dip our toes into Shakespeare a little bit here, and because it's, I don't know, because it's interesting. She asks, what kind of dialogue can you conduct with yourself when your soul is not in harmony but at war with itself? Precisely the dialogue we overhear when Shakespeare's Richard III, not the second, my apologies, is alone. And here we go. I'm not going to do justice. What do I fear? Myself. There's none else by. Richard loves Richard. That is, I am I. Is there a murderer here? No. Yes, I am. Then fly. What? From myself. Great reason why. Lest I revenge. What? Myself upon myself? Alack, I love myself. Wherefore, for any good, that I myself have done unto myself? Oh, no, alas, I rather hate myself. For hateful deeds committed by myself. I am a villain, yet I lie. I am not. Fool, of thyself speak well. Fool, do not flatter. And so and then her commentary is such, yet all this looks very different when midnight is past and Richard has escaped in his own company to join that of his peers. Then, conscience is but a word that cowards use, devised at first to keep the strong in awe. Conscious is a word that, cowards use this word conscience. And it's devised to keep the strong in awe. Complex, Shakespeare's complex, right? And she goes on to say, even Socrates, so much in love with the marketplace, has to go home where he will be alone in solitude in order to meet the other fellow. This other fellow, you could say a part of himself, or you could say some people it might be a higher authority or whatever, but this idea that you're not really alone. So she says that Socrates was a gadfly. Well, that's what Socrates said. And a midwife. Those are the two metaphors that she mentions here. And a friend to everyone, or knows about everything and wants to talk to everybody. But even he's got the extrovert, if that's what he is, got to go home. He's an ambivert. He's both. He's got to go home and commune, with himself and conduct what he and she calls evidently the two in one. Which for Arendt, of course, is a specific thing, and which is not synonymous with stuff that happens in the head. It's not synonymous with even fleeting thoughts, images, pictures. No, it's a particular activity. And here we go. She's going to, thinking in its non-cognitive, non-specialized sense as a natural need of human life, the actualization of the difference given in consciousness is not a prerogative of the few, but an ever-present faculty in everybody. By the same token, inability to think is not a failing of the many who lack brain power, but an ever-present possibility for everybody. Scientists, scholars, and other specialists in mental enterprises not excluded. Everybody may come to shun that intercourse with oneself, whose feasibility and importance Socrates first discovered. Thinking accompanies life and is itself the dematerialized quintessence of being alive. Now that's a phrase there. She doesn't say, she could have written, thinking accompanies life and is itself the essence of being alive. She don't say that. She doesn't say that, right? Nah, she's got to put it this way. Its quintessence can only lie. She has to put it this way. Thinking accompanies life and is itself the dematerialized quintessence of being alive. And since life is a process, its quintessence can only lie in the actual thinking process and not in any solid results or specific thought. So she's inveighing against utilitarianism, which is partly a British invention. She's being true to her European roots and saying, you empiricists, you analytic philosophers, you the Ayers of the world and the Quines of the world and the Bertrand Russells of the world, with your, I'm sort of caricaturing her point of view again. I'm not saying I think this necessarily, but with your belief in results and goal orientation and quantification and measurement, a tradition that in large part may have delivered to us or cursed us with AI itself. I don't know. There's many influences. It's strange. Some early AI researchers were Heideggerians, which is her tradition, right? So I don't know. It's a mess. But so Evan asked a really good question as a midwife. I don't know. That's a really important question. Do you want to do the detective work now and answer it? Here we go. Try to do this here. It has a glossary. I don't know. 168. Okay. Bear with me. This is for Evan, who's so thankful to Evan coming in and here we go. She says he called himself a gadfly and a midwife. So I guess that's what Socrates said about himself. Another person called him an electric ray, a fish that paralyzes and numbs by contact. So more specifically, Socrates says, I am sterile like the midwives in Greece. That's what he says. I don't know. Who were beyond the age of childbearing. And that's connected, it says, she says he had nothing to teach, no truth to hand out. He was accused of never revealing his own view, as we learned from Xenophon, who defended him against the charge. Now that gets into the trial of Socrates. It's like one of the charges, many charges against him, corrupting younger people, corrupting is bad for society. Yeah, that's right. Midwife gives birth to wisdom because he has a barrenness about him, I guess. So I guess it's he doesn't give birth here, He's a guy. He doesn't have the correct equipment physically, or he doesn't even. But he can give birth to this over here. It's like a shift of energy. You know, energy goes where it has to go. And so yes, you get giving birth to wisdom because he's not busy breastfeeding or something, and not busy, you know, I don't know, having sex or whatever the thing. You know, again, is a question of, you know, different aspects of life and all that. And I may be having too much fun with it, maybe, and making it too. Maybe I could be accused of being a little bit too. Maybe too playful. I don't know, but I'm just also this is all improvised. I didn't plan any of this, you know, other than reading the text, you know, and so I'm going to talk a little bit about the preview of willing. So she says it herself in Postscriptum 21. In the second volume of this work, I should deal with willing and judging, the two other mental activities. Looked at from the perspective of these time speculations, they concern matters that are absent either because they are not yet or because they are no more. But in contradistinction to the thinking activity, which deals with the invisibles in all experience and always tends to generalize. They always deal with particulars, and in this respect are much closer to the world of appearances. I may have to go over that again, right? I mean, maybe. These European, I call them European continental type sentences, you know, these kind of I don't know. They concern matters that are absent either because they are not yet or because they are no more. And here it is. But in contradistinction to the thinking activity, which deals with the invisibles in all experience and always tend to generalize, they always deal with particulars. That which is not general. You know, she just got through talking about everybody and unanimity and unity and stuff, a word. Available to everybody. Everybody can think. And now she's talking about these particulars. In this respect are much closer to the world of appearances. If we wish to placate our common sense, so decisively offended by the need of reason to pursue its purposeless quest for meaning. That was a mouthful. I'm going to go back. So I wonder what Gottlieb, if he were her editor, or I'm trying these names. Who is the editor of Raymond Carver? List. These different, all these famous editors. One just passed, Gottlieb, right? Just died. I wonder what they would make of some of this here. If we wish to placate our common sense, so decisively offended by the need of reason to pursue his purposeless quest for meaning. So that's just common sense. Common sense doesn't lie. Common sense is the caricatured utilitarians and empiricists. I just mentioned it. What's it good for? What's the purpose? You know, what do we get? What do you get to the story? Yes, Gordon Lish. Thank you. Yes. Yeah, that's right. Thank you. Getting to it, right? So, what we call common sense. And it's offended. It's offended by the need of reason. It's offended by, again, purposeless quest for meaning. Again, it's anti-Socratic. Socrates just got through telling us, I don't have a goal. He also says he's interested, by the way, in teaching virtue at one at the same time, even though he says he doesn't have a goal. But it's you know, complicated, you know. Doesn't have a common sense. She goes on, it is tempting to justify this need solely on the grounds that thinking is an indispensable preparation for deciding what shall be and for evaluating what is no more. So she says we're always wanting to create some damn goal. We get rid of one goal and we want to justify thinking. What's thinking good for? She says, well, it's setting up a better society or a best society, a utopia, or it's for this, or deciding what the legislature should decide, or deciding what Congress should enact, or deciding what the composition of the Supreme Court could or should be. Heaven help us, and all that. So it's kind of that kind of thing. It's sort of like, wills. Valuing what is no more. Since the past being past becomes subject to our judgment, judgment in turn would be a mere preparation for willing. This is undeniably the perspective, and within limits, legitimate perspective of man insofar as he is an acting being. And so insofar as he is acting, it's legitimate to think this way. But this last attempt to defend the thinking activity against the reproach of being impractical, what they say about academics, impractical, ivory tower, elites, right? Impractical. And useless, this attempt to defend thinking does not work. The decision the will arrives at can never be derived from the mechanics of desire or the deliberations of the intellect that may precede it, that is, precede the desire. So she's saying you can't get away from inclination and you can't get away from desire. And I guess maybe eros, you can't get away from that. Maybe, she's saying. I don't know. The will is either an organ of free spontaneity that interrupts all causal chains of motivation that would bind it, or it is nothing but an illusion. And way back in 1973, she's talking about what everybody today seems to always be talking about. Is the will free? Determinism, causality, all the same. All the old material. She's saying, in respect to desire on one hand and to reason on the other, the will acts like a kind of coup d'etat, as Henri Bergson once said. And this implies, of course, that Bergson's quote here, free acts are exceptional. Although we are free, this is still Bergson, whenever we are willing to get back into ourselves, it seldom happens that we are willing. And she adds she italicizes that. It seldom happens that we are willing. In other words, it is impossible to deal with the willing activity without touching on the problem of freedom. Got to get to freedom, she's saying. I propose to take the internal evidence in Bergson's terms, the immediate datum of consciousness, quote unquote, seriously. And since I agree with many writers on this subject that this datum and all problems connected with it were unknown to Greek antiquity, so she's saying she agrees with the historical interpretation by which will is kind of a recent thing, or relatively recent, thinking that way. It's similar to Isaiah Berlin's rather bold and assertion that sincerity is so recent. I think he dates sincerity to the 1780s or something, or I don't know. In his lectures on romanticism, I mean, at least sincerity in the sense that we think of it, because for Isaiah Berlin, in the old world, that traditional society, you were either right or wrong, and if you were wrong and preaching wrongness, you could be killed, or the state will kill you, or the church will kill you, or you were right. So in other words, you were either pregnant or not pregnant, and it was either daytime or it was night, and that was sort of the end of discussion. And, to encapsulate Berlin's magnificent achievement is to discover that a modern world revolution happens in which people start to give credit to this thing called intention. what did the person really feel? What was their belief when they did that act? And for him, for thousands of years, people didn't think about internal states that way. I mean, interesting. And this sort of connects to that in a way, because she's saying the will, is for in Hannah Arendt's formulation, is a kind of a recent thing. Thinking about it is kind of recent. Now, Bernard Williams in Shame and Necessity, I mentioned that text before about the ancient world, antiquity. Bernard Williams says that actually, in that book, he goes through and looks at Sophocles and Aristophanes. He's saying, look here, Aristophanes had a concept of will and indecision, and it's there. It's not there to the exact same degree it is for us in the contemporary world, but there's traces of it, and thinkers discuss these things, and I'm always less interested, of course. I mean, I do accept Berlin partly. I do think that some of these things that we think of as eternal and always within us may have been invented by us, perhaps, and then they become so natural to us, like second nature, that we think they were always there. That's possible. Sincerity in Berlin's case. Authenticity. Lionel Trilling, sincerity and authenticity. I think this might be a good place to stop. I mean, she's giving you the sneak preview of willing and toying with, where the will comes in. And if we're going to talk about the will, we got to talk about drumroll freedom. Or lack thereof. And so I enjoyed doing this. I hope I did. I'm always a little bit humbled by her in these episodes because I'm trying to do justice to this text. And I'm trying to do justice to these thinkers. And yet at the same time, I'm trying to be clear to a general audience, of course. And I do the best I can. And, we're on a Friday and it's 2 minutes past the hour, past 1. And I want to thank you for coming out. And we will have episode 5 next month, and we'll get to willing. And like with everything else, I anticipate that Hannah Arendt might define the will a little differently than how... Thank you, Yvette. Thanks, everybody. Peter, she might probably define it differently in the way you or I might define it or think of it. Certainly than the way a scientist would, or maybe not. I don't know. Now, Evan's discussing the negation. We'll get to all this, some of it, not all of it, some of it hopefully soon. But thank you, there is some of that there. Have a good weekend if you can. And May's a big month for our show. We got 3 for the price of 1. We got 3 interconnected episodes with 3 different people. Marty Davidson, Lee Purcell, me, Sandy Davidson. I'm really excited about this coming up. 3 artists and talking to them. So look for that. I'm very excited about that. We're going to talk more about it, but that's coming up this month. That's interesting. So have a good weekend, and I enjoyed doing this, and to be continued. Thank you.